We've identified something called a channel strip, but what does it actually do? A channel strip is simply a row or strip of controls that all relate to a single input channel. A quick glance at a channel strip will tell you an awful lot about a mixer. What sort of EQ or tone control it offers, how much flexibility there is in terms of monitoring and patching in effects. At the top is one of the most crucial areas of the mixer, the input. This is important both in terms of the quality of the actual components and the care that you take in terms of setting the input level. This is the point at which your sound source enters the mixer, and the strength of this signal is governed by the gain control, sometimes referred to as a trim pot. This regulates the strength of input signal. On some mixers you may also find a pad switch for instant attenuation. Sometimes you might even find a pad switch and a trim pot. Learning to set these controls properly is really important. If a sound gets off on the wrong foot, so to speak, it's almost impossible to correct the problem later on. Whoever coined the phrase, "fix it in the mix," certainly didn't mix live sound. First, you need to make sure that the sound source is coming into the mixer at a level that will give you as much clean, i.e. undistorted, signal as possible. Ideally, you want to end up with all your sound sources at the same strength of signal. You'll need to make adjustments at this stage because different devices output sound at different levels. Microphones, for instance, output low-level signals and so need greater initial amplification here. Electronic keyboards, effects units or CD players produce more initial signal, so they don't require as much amplification. The reason setting input gain is so important is that if you don't get enough signal into the mixer, the signal won't be strong enough and attempts to increase the output volume will add noise and hiss. Bad news, to be sure. But worse, if you have too much signal coming in, your sound is going to be distorted. If a sound is distorted at the input stage, you'll never be able to undistort it. It's like trying to carry an overflowing bucket of water. It'll never work. You need to take some water out, then you can carry it. These initial decisions are crucial to what is referred to as your gain structure, basically keeping your mixer and mix as free from either distortion or extraneous noise as possible. Good gain structure is essential if you want your mix to sound clean and punchy.
By far you have to have proper gain structure. Without proper gain structure you're 10 steps behind.
Okay, to set the input gain properly, position your channel fader at 0 dB or unity gain, and then ask the performer to send the strongest or loudest signal he or she is likely to play or sing. Make your adjustment so that the meter or peak LED for that channel just nudges into the red. If your input signal barely registers, then you need to increase the gain. If the signal is too hot or loud, like this, you need to turn it down. Following good gain structure practices at each stage that sound passes through your mixer is half the battle when it comes to getting a good mix. Armed with this array of knobs, you may be tempted to now start fiddling around, adjusting tone controls, adding effects and so on. But in fact, the sound system actually consists of more than just electronic gear. Professional audio engineers know that a good sound starts at the source. In fact, most of these folks live by the rule, he who uses EQ and effects the least, uses them best. So, if the singer sounds like he's got bronchitis or the snare drum sounds feeble, the first thing you need to do is to make sure that the microphone is positioned as it should be in order to capture the sound properly. Then you might want to try swapping the mic, or suggest tactfully that the drummer may want to tune his snare or even replace one of the heads. The point is, the better the original sound, the better your final mix will turn out because you're not having to compensate for weaknesses that you have little control over. You're simply making the performances louder. Sometimes tonal adjustment is necessary, and that's where these next controls come into play. EQ is short for equalization, and all mixers offer some form of control, be it a simple high, mid or low, boost or cut like the tone controls on a basic home stereo, or a sophisticated system where particular frequencies in a sound can be isolated and adjusted. We'll look at the whole subject of EQ in greater detail in another scene. For now though, here are 3 handy tips to keep in mind about EQ. 1. Use it sparingly. Too much EQ will almost invariably make a sound unnatural. 2. Cutting or reducing the level of certain frequencies can be just as powerful as boosting frequencies when it comes to improving a sound or curing a problem. 3. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. If a sound doesn't need any tonal adjustment, don't make any. And to help solve some specific problems, here is a simple switch that automatically filters out low rumble type noise. It's called a high-pass filter. This switch comes in handy if you want to reduce wind noise from microphones when working outside. It could also protect your loudspeakers from damage if someone accidentally dropped a microphone. Mixers are riddled with abbreviated names for odd-sounding features. And here's another one, aux. The prime duty of a mixer is to combine multiple sound sources into one unified signal going out into the main speakers. That's not all they do though. Most mixers provide auxes, or auxiliary signal buses, that tackle additional requirements such as being able to add effects to a particular sound and being able to deliver a mix for monitors on stage. Both such capabilities are handled by auxiliary buses and controls, normally referred to by their abbreviated name of aux. When you see an aux rotary control on a channel strip, it's really just another level control, adjusting the amount of signal from that channel to that particular aux bus. Aux buses come in two varieties, namely pre-fader or post-fader. Sometimes they can be switched, as indeed they can here. If the aux bus is pre-fader, this means that your sound is being sent to the aux buses before it comes under the control of its main channel fade. Pre meaning previous or before. What does that mean though? Well, it means that adjusting the main channel fader will not disturb the amount of signal going to the aux bus. And that's important because you don't want, say, a monitor mix to change just because a particular sound has been increased or decreased in the main mix. Sounds reasonable, doesn't it? So why on earth would we need a post-fader setting then? Think about effects. Say you set up a nice effect on a voice, some slapback echo or reverb. Now, if you want to adjust the overall level of that vocal, you'll also want to adjust what gets sent to the effects device. So if this aux is post-fader, post meaning after the fader, then the two will always go hand in hand, just as you wanted. Moving down, pan is another abbreviated term, short for panorama. Just as it sounds, the pan control can send a particular input to the far left, far right, or dead center. While we're on the subject of panning, it's best not to pan signals full left or full right. In a live sound setting, very few people in the audience will be hearing both left and right speakers equally. And if you completely pan something all the way to the right, people on the left-hand side of the audience probably won't be able to hear it at all. While most switches and controls actively process or affect sounds, others are there just to help you keep track of things. And this can be very important when you have the pressure of a live show to deal with. This switch, for instance, gives you a helpful visual indication of which channels are on and are being sent into the main stereo outputs. This small switch, marked PFL, which stands for pre-fader listen, allows you to instantly hear the sound of that particular channel in your headphones, no matter whether the channel fader is up or down. And this can be a great help to check and confirm signals without disturbing your main mix. PFL is also extremely helpful when setting your initial input levels, because you can do this A, without the sound coming out of the mains, and B, because you can make use of the main level meters for additional visual help. Finally is the fader or slider that increases or decreases the channel output. Some mixers may use a knob for this, but the function is the same. We've covered a lot of ground here, so let's recap. At the top of the channel strip are the input controls where you set the level of signal coming into the particular channel. This is followed by EQ controls that govern tone. Then come the aux send levels, sending varying amounts of your channel to the monitor mix or to a connected effects processor. And finally come the pan control, channel on switch and main channel fader. Encouragingly then, you can see that we've covered more than 3/4 of the controls in this mixer. Enough theory for the moment. Let's take one or two individual instruments and see what happens in practice.
The first thing I like to start with is the bass. The bass player here has a nice amp that has a balanced line out feature that makes it really easy to get a good bass sound in the mixer. I just need to take a long XLR cable from the amp and plug it into one of our mixer channels. Then I ask the bass player to play about as loud as he thinks he's going to play. I turn on the pre-fader listen and then adjust the trim pot so that I get a good hot signal that just peaks in the red but doesn't really distort. This bass player uses a lot of finger technique as well as slap and pop styles, so I've inserted a compressor in the channel just to smooth the dynamics out a little bit. The bass sound already has enough bass on it, so I don't really need to do any boosting there, but I like to add a bit of mid-range growl to the bass. Depending on how much slapping or popping he's doing or playing with his fingers, sometimes I'll add just a little extra high end just to help cut through the mix. Once I have a sound that I'm happy with, I turn off my PFL and I bring up the channel fader and see how it sounds in the main speakers. Because the bass player already has an amp on stage, there's no real reason to add any bass into the monitor mix. There's already plenty of volume from his amp for the rest of the band to hear. As for the snare drum, we're going to position the mic down towards the head of the snare. Our drummer's already tightened up the head, and we've got a good initial sound. Once we've gotten the mic positioned, it's pretty much the same process like I did with the bass player. I get the drummer to play just about as loud as he's going to play on the snare drum, and I bring up the trim control, adjusting the volume till I get a good signal but not too hot. I like a nice punchy sound to my snare, so one thing I'm going to do is add a little EQ. There's not a lot of bass already on the snare, so I don't have to do anything there, but I'm going to add a little high end to give a good snap, and a little mid-range like I did with the bass to give it some growl. Once I get a sound I'm happy with, I'll turn off my PFL, bring up the channel volume, and have a listen to how it sounds through the main speakers.
No matter what your sound source, this is a very typical way that you would use the controls in a channel strip. There's more information on handling different instruments, mics and singers in the soundcheck scene, and more on the use of EQ and effects in the individual EQ and effect scenes.